Welcome to day 5 of the Portia Party Dress sew along. Today we're going to be doing the side seams. Now I've got my dress so that the dress is right side to right side. I've got the back underneath and the top in front. There's a couple of things I want to point out before we get into doing it. Firstly is if you have got pins in your shoulder seams to let you know which way is up, you can take them out now. I haven't taken those out, and you certainly can do. They are quite definitely the shoulder seams, and we're not going to get them muddled now. The front is shorter than the back, so when you lay it like this and you line up this seam along here to the seam of the back at the side seam here, and you line up the bottom of the sleeves, you'll find that the front is marginally shorter than the back on most of the sizes. That's correct. That's how you get that little kind of shaping in the back. Something else to note is that in the pattern you do the shoulder seams before the side seam on nearly every version of the pattern, except I believe it is the lined version. Excuse me, we're not going to do that. We're going to be doing the side seams first, and that's so that I can show you the lined version as well at the same time. So, but if you wanted to do the shoulder seams first, you could, and then move on to the side seams afterwards. Totally up to you. We're going to do the side seams first though today. So this is the knit version. I'm going to show you this one first, then I'll show you the woven version with a zip after we've done this one. The knit version, you'll be pleased to hear, is really quick and simple. We are just going to align these this underbust seam with the seam from the back, and pin or clip those there. Then we're going to align and pin at the end of the sleeve, and then we're going to align going down the skirt to the hem. I would always do it in that order so that you get this correct, and then, because you can always adjust at the hem if you need to, but these are the ones that make the difference for the fit. Oh, now something else to mention before we move on to actually doing it is that the sleeve hem and the skirt hem we do at the very end. Now if you are doing a very small size, for example the doll size or one of the baby sizes, you might want to hem your sleeves first before you do the side seam or the shoulder seam, so that they're in the start again. You want to do either the side seam or the shoulder seam and then hem the sleeves so that you've got them attached only in one point, so that then you can open it up and you can hem your sleeves all in one go, versus if you do the shoulder seam and the side seam, you're doing what's called hemming in the round, or stitching in the round. So you're stitching in a round circle, which is absolutely fine for the bigger kid sizes and the ladies, because you can easily get them on your machine. But when you're doing the dolls and it's like that big and you're trying to get that, you press the foot in there and stitch all the way around there. That's kind of difficult. So I recommend that you excuse me, if you're doing a very small size, do the sleeve hem first, or do either the shoulder or the side seam, then the sleeve hem, and then skip on to the next day, tomorrow, where we do the shoulder seam. Hope that makes sense. If it didn't, ask in the comments and I can clarify. Right, let's move on and do the knit version first. So we're going to do the knit version first, and the first thing I'm going to do is rotate my dress around so that I can get to it easily, and I'm going to pin at this side seam here at the juncture where the top meets the skirt. So this is the seam between the top front and the front skirt, top back skirt, and I'm going to put my pin, and you could use clips as well, but I particularly like I usually use clips the whole time, and then pins for particular points where I want to get absolute accuracy, and I like these to match up exactly. Firstly because they should, and secondly because I like how it looks at the side seam, where you can see the seam line running continuously between the front and the back. So I put my pin through the stitch line on the front, and then I check it's come out on the stitch line on the back. So that pin is now going through the stitch line on the front and the stitch line on the back. I know that that's going to match up exactly, and then I put it back through the stitch line here and the stitch line there, just to make sure I've not twisted it. And then now I know that's going to match up at the side seam. And then the other thing I do is I put a pin through the seam allowance. Now I'm going to be stitching from the armhole downwards, and I would always stitch from the armhole downwards because I don't want to start at the hem and misalign it and get up here excuse me, to discover a bubble of fabric. So if I start here and go down excuse me, if I misalign the fabric, I can correct it by trimming at the hem if I need to. Ideally you don't. Ideally you keep your fabric aligned the whole way and the tension the same between the two layers the whole way down so that it matches up exactly at the hem. But if it doesn't, or if you've cut it on two different lines or something like that at the hem, you can correct it easily going this way. So I'm going to pin right at the very edge of the sleeve hem, and then because this is curved, I will also put a pin or a clip part way through, because I want to make sure that I keep that aligned up down there. Oh, and this is what I was going to say here, is the other place I'll put a pin is through the seam allowances on both sides in the direction I want them to be pressed, or the direction they have been pressed, because these have been pressed upwards. I want my pin to hold it there so that as I'm stitching down and around and over this bend, my presser foot doesn't pull this down and stitch it down that way at the seam, because then what I've got is it pressed upwards here, and it needs to be pressed upwards here because you've got that point. If you press it downwards, it just goes all weird, and then there'll be this big lump because it's held down by the stitching along there. So I want that to definitely stay upwards as I stitch past it. And because I'm doing this on camera, I will be really good and pin the rest of my skirt, but frankly I don't always. Quite often I will just hold it and know that I've hopefully got it aligned all the way to the hem, and 9 times out of 10 that works fine. But what I would recommend doing is, because it doesn't always, is to pin all the way to the hem to know that you've got that lined up and you're going to meet your hem there. So what you need to do now is go away and pin both sides, so pin that side and then pin the other side as well, and then we're going to stitch it. So I have pinned this other side, and then I've gone ahead and I've stitched down using a 1/2 inch seam allowance on the other side. When you do this, start at the sleeve hem and go downwards for the same reason I said just before, that you don't want to go upwards and create it not matching up here. If you go from the sleeve down, you're more likely to have it matching. And then the same for this side. So normally I would always pin from the same side, but because I want to have this, I want to be able to stitch from here downwards, and I don't want to have to put my fabric into my machine with this all bunched up on the inside bit of the machine. I want the fabric hanging off the outside of my machine. What I will do when I sew this is just flip it over so that I can still start from the sleeve and work down, if that hopefully makes sense. So what I'd like you to do is go ahead now and stitch down each side seam. If you are going to leave your edges raw, because this is the knit version, you could you can go ahead and then trim your seam allowance to approximately half once you're finished doing that, because this bit under the arm, particularly here, now has quite a bit of bulk, and you don't want to leave quite that much there where it's supposed to be drapey. So trim that down to half. If you're going to serge, you could serge half of your seam allowance off and just leave the bottom half. What I would recommend though for side seams is that you don't just serge the seam, but you stitch it using a stretch stitch on your sewing machine and then serge it. Unless you've got a serger which is really, really awesome and you really trust the that inside stitch line before it then overcasts the edge. Like I've got a 4 thread overlocker, and it does do that inside stitch line, so technically I don't need to do the stitch line down here, but I just don't, if I serge an edge and I haven't stitched it and then I open it up and I give it a pull, I can often see little bits of light kind of through the fabric, so I can see that it's not holding it together as tightly as my sewing machine does. Now that might be the quality of my serger, or that it needs some kind of tension change, but that is a pretty common thing that I do see on serger groups, people complaining of this. So if your machine is like mine and it does that, then definitely do a stitch down with your stretch stitch on your sewing machine and then serge the edge, or if you're not going to serge it, then just trim it down to half. So let's go ahead and do that now. So there we go, we have stitched, and now I've serged my side seams, or you could just trim them. And if we have a little look inside here, you will see hopefully that my my side seam goes straight down, and it looks as if the seam goes straight across, but that's actually the front and the back intersecting in a perfect little square, which makes me happy seeing that. It drives me crazy when it's not like that. I love that little kind of look there. So that is it for the knit version today. If you're doing the knit version, you can pop your feet up and have a relax now, and tune in tomorrow for the shoulder seams and our hems. If you are doing the woven version, we will carry on in a moment. Now before we go on to the woven, what I thought I should mention is the knit lined version. If you're doing the knit lined version, it is exactly the same as just the regular knit version for the side seams, that you are going to stitch, and then if you want to serge or trim each of these side seams with the front right sides together with the back for both your main, and then also I will show you my lining, which is my lace. No, wrong way around, my goodness. This is my the lace is my outer, the pink is my lining, because what I want to do is get this effect here where you can see the pink through the lace. That was what my daughter specifically requested for this dress. So what I have done for my lace is I've done exactly the same thing. I've pinned at the side seams and then I have stitched down, but I am not going to serge these edges, because you'll be able to see the lace, you'll be able to see the seam allowance through the lace on, because my my lining is a different colour, and what I don't want is a really big white line of serger thread running down the side seams or the bust or any of the other areas. So I'm not going to serge these ones, and I know that the fabric does not fray very much at all, so I'm quite happy with that. So if you are doing the lined knit version of the dress, you can go ahead and do exactly the same thing we just did in the knit version, only to finish your side seams. So down both sides from the sleeve hem all the way through to the bottom of the dress. And if you're doing the lined version, do not start with the shoulder seams. You know, I said about the armhole, that if you're doing the dolls or a small baby size for any of the other knit or woven options, that you could do the shoulder seams first and then finish the sleeve hem and then do the side seams. Don't do that with the lined knit version or the lined woven. Either way, for the lined version, one of the last things we do is finish the shoulder seams, and that's where it all holds together. And that means that because it's going to be held together at the shoulder seam, the dress and the lining won't do this at the shoulder. They will be attached at the shoulder, so that the dress and the lining can move independently further down the dress, but they're going to stay together here, which is where we don't want them to slip, so that the bust and the back all sit really nicely when you're wearing it. So if you are doing a doll or a baby size for the lined option, what you could do is stitch the side seams down first and then open it up, and then you could finish your sleeve hem here if you're doing one of those small sizes. If you're doing a big kid size or a lady size like this, that is more than enough space to be able to easily get that on my machine and finish it in whatever way I'm going to finish it around. It's just where you're doing the doll size, where if you stretch the whole sleeve out, it's only like about that long. It's like tiny. tiny little round hole. So that's what we're doing now, and then now we're going to move on to the woven version. Now this is the woven version we're going to do now. This version requires a zip, and we're going to use an invisible zipper. You could use a non-invisible zipper, just a regular zip, but you would need to make sure that you lapped the fabric so that it touched in the middle, because the zipper space is designed for the two fabrics to be touching using an invisible zipper. And if you use a regular zipper, usually there's a little gap. So if you're going to use a regular zipper and you know how to do it, make sure you get the two fabrics touching. Otherwise you will find that the garment is a good kind of 1/4 to 1/2 inch wider around the waist than you're expecting it to be, which doesn't sound like much, but when you've got such an open top and then a fitted kind of midsection and then such a open bottom part of the dress, that's the only fitted bit, so you want to make sure that it fits as it is intended there. Now, a couple of things to note. The zip is a little bit tricky because it's going to start around the corner of the sleeve and then come down. The ladies zip, you will see that it is a really, really long zip that's recommended in the pattern. As I mentioned on the very first video, that is because when we tested it, we discovered that some ladies, which is generally from about size M upwards to size 5XL, found it absolutely fine to get in the dress in and out comfortably with a zip that was about 18 inches long, whereas the ladies who were in the smaller sizes, the XXS through to the S, some of them found it okay for the smaller zip, but most of them found they needed a longer zip just because of the way the proportions of the dress are on the proportions of the smaller or petite sized people. So that said, we had a couple of larger ladies, I think like 2 out of the 140 that we had, who had a few problems on the other sizes as well. So what I would recommend is that you get a 22-inch zip, that you baste it in. If you really don't want the long zip, is that you baste it in and check, or get the smaller zip if you've got one on hand, baste it in, and which is the if you're not familiar with the term basting, it's a long loose stitch which you can then easily pull out afterwards, and just check whether or not you can get the dress on easily or not, because I would hate you to stitch in the smaller zip, finish it all up beautifully, and then not be able to get it on. That would be really horrible. So that's what I recommend for that. If you are doing the lined version, it is exactly the same for this first part as for the unlined option. What we are going to do for the lining is we're going to insert your zip on your outer fabric, and then on your lining you're going to stitch down the sleeve and below the zip and leave the zip section open so that we can line the zip area. So that's the only difference between the lined and the non-lined. And then on the other side of the side seam, once we've done the zip on the other side seam, we're just going to stitch all the way down and then finish the seams. Now because it's lined, no, that's not right, because it's woven, start again, because it's woven, the seams are going to need finishing. You can leave them raw, but most woven fabrics will fray, and if I just kind of pick at this a bit with my nail, I don't have to pick it very much at all to see that the fabric's starting to fray. I really shouldn't have done that before I start stitching. That's a bad idea. I was trying to show you and now I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm making a hole. Anyway, you will need to finish these side seams if you want to get good wear out of the garment. If you're only going to wear it a few times, you could leave them, but I like everything to be as beautiful on the inside as outside. And you'll see this is the one of the ones where I've showed you some serging versus some hidden seam options. So you could serge, or you could use bias tape. Either one is absolutely fine to complete your seams with. And the bias tape option, we're doing exactly the same thing as we've done in our previous bias tapes, except rather than bias tape Here we go, I've got bias tape on the other side. These dresses where I make them showing you on camera end up with a mishmash of all different kind of styles as I'm showing you different things, but that's okay. So this bias tape here, you'll see it encloses both of the seam allowances from both the top and the skirt. The way we're going to finish the seam allowance for the side seam is we're going to put our zip in and then stitch above and below the zip so that the seam is finished, and then to do the finishing of the seam we're going to do what's called a Hong Kong finish, which is pretty much the same thing, except you finish the front of the back of the garment with one set of bias tape, and then you finish the front with another set of bias tape, and then you press them open. So when you look at your finished seam, and obviously this isn't what it'll be like, it's obviously going to be much smaller like that, but when you press your finished seam open, you'll see bias tape running down each side of the garment. So it's a very fiddly little technique. It's very easy, but it's a kind of fiddly, just like this is fiddly, but you've got to curve it around the edge. It's very, very, very pretty on the inside of the garment, but you could just use serging. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you this one doing serging, and then if you need any clarification on the bias tape, just ask in the questions, but I'll show you at the end where it is supposed to go. But it is exactly the same technique, it's just doing each of the seams individually. So that's what we're going to do. So if you are going to be doing serging, the first thing to do is to serge down both side seams of the back and then down both side seams of the front individually. So you are only serging through one layer of fabric, and you are not taking any of the seam allowance off, you are just finishing the edges. So I'd like you to go away and do that now before we start, so that you've got that finished and done. We don't do that at the end because you've got the zip, and the zip gets in the way of doing that. So let's go and do that now, and then we'll come back and we'll start our zip. So before we start stitching the actual zip, I want to show you what you're going to need. Firstly, you'll need your top back woven pattern piece, which shows you where the zip aligns. And then secondly, you're going to need an invisible zipper. Now, just in case you're not sure on what the difference is between an invisible one and a non-invisible one, this is an invisible zip, this is not an invisible zip. So this one here, you can see the zipper teeth stick out and they are kind of protruding above the zip. This one here, the invisible zip, the teeth are actually on the opposite side. So you can see here the teeth are both sticking out, but the zip is underneath and the zip is on top. So that's essentially what an invisible zip is the teeth are underneath versus on top, where the puller thing, oh my goodness, I don't know what that's called, the little, you know, the zip bit. Anyway, and also invisible zippers often have really pretty kind of ends to the zip. I don't know why, they just do. Sometimes you get really decorational ones, and I believe you can also get ones that you can take these off and replace them with pretty little jewel things. Anyway, that's what you want. You do not want the other one. Now, before anyone comments, because I'm sure somebody will, this is not the correct length zip for the size 3 to 4 years that I'm doing. I have the correct length zip, but I have it in white, and I'm really trying to make sure that I pick colours after picking that white spotty fabric that's really hard to see on camera. I'm now trying to make sure I pick colours that you can see easily against my dress. So I've got blue, which kind of matches my dress, but wouldn't have been my first choice. So that's why I'm using that particular one, and I'm just going to hope that my daughter can still get in and out of it, because it's not quite the right length. Anyway, let's move on. The very first thing is you need your back fabric piece only, which is this one here, and you need it facing upwards, so facing right side up. Now I'm going to do it on this side of the dress. You can do the zip on either side, it's completely up to you. If you're right-handed, you probably want it on one side. If you're left-handed, you probably want it on the other. If you're wearing it yourself, if you're doing it for a child, you'd want it on the other side, the opposite side, because you're doing the dress up for the child or down. So probably stand there and see what's most comfortable. If you're trying to pick a side, I'm right-handed, I would probably put it down my right hand side. So as I'm looking at the garment, I would put it down this side of the back, not down the left hand side, but I'm going to do this one down the left hand side, because that's where I've got the seam allowance all prepared for you. So I have serged this individually on its own, and now I'm taking my pattern piece, and you'll see here the zip piece is marked, and it's actually marked on the wrong side. I want to flip this over because I want to do it on this side. So what I'm going to have to do is just mark through the fabric, through the paper, so that I can see where it goes. So that I've just marked on the other side, and I'm going to line up my pattern piece with the raw edge of the sleeve. I'm not going to line it up with where the back skirt meets the top, because of course my seam allowance is down in here and I've already trimmed part of that off. So I'm going to line it up here, and then I know that when it meets the curve, it's meeting in the right place. So I'm going to take a pin, and I would probably do this on my ironing board so that I could put the pin straight down and get it really accurate, but I'm going to do it on here to show you, and I am trying to get my pin to right where I want the top of the zipper to go. So let me just check that that is accurate. Let's go a bit further around. This isn't the most accurate way of doing it. Place it on your ironing board, and then you can just put your pin straight down and get it exactly in the right place. That is better. There we go. So I can put my pattern piece aside. I don't need that now. This is where my zipper is going to start, and it's going to start 1/2 inch in from the edge, and it's going to come down and around there. So it is curving around slightly. You might be wondering, why didn't we just start the zip down here, where it's a nice straight line and a lot easier to put in? You could do that, and if you are near the bottom of your size range, so let's say your size range goes from 36-inch waist through to 41-inch waist. Now that's a complete guess, I can't remember whether that's a size or not, but let's just say it did. If you are down at the 36-inch end of that size range, then yes, you could probably get away with doing that, or if your fabric has a little bit of give. But if you are at the upper end of your size range, then that's going to make it really, really difficult to get in and out of the garment. You need that the extra space around the narrowest part of the garment that opening up a zip can provide, which is about here. It's just below this waist area where the narrowest bit is. So if we extend the zip up to just above the waist area, this little bit here really does help with making it comfortable to get the dress on and off. Now the next thing that we should be doing is placing our zip down and pinning it on, but with an invisible zipper, and this is not mentioned in the pattern, but is one of my little tricks. When I open it up, that's the front of the zipper. If I open it up to the back, this coil, if I kind of roll it, see that's it there, and if I roll it open, that gives me much easier access into the teeth. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work out where I want my zipper to go. So I want my zip to be, it's going to be going like this on the fabric, and this is the side. I've got my zip, I'm just trying to explain two things at once, which never works. If I place my zip right side down onto my fabric, this left hand side of the zip is what's going to attach to the back of the dress, and then if you imagine this kind of curled upwards and then attached to the front of the garment, and then I can undo the zip like that. So this left hand side of the zip here is the one that's going to be attaching to the dress. So when I open my zip up, it's this side of the zipper I'm going to be working with first, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go away to my iron and I'm going to uncurl this tooth bit here, and I'm going to just press it open slightly. I'm not like, don't use steam and really force it in there, just give it a nice light press. And if you've got plastic zipper teeth, you might want to put a presser cloth between your zip and your iron so that you don't mark your iron or wreck your the teeth of your zip. if you don't have a presser cloth, it's just a usually a piece of really sturdy thin cotton that stops you singeing anything or getting any marks on your iron. I actually use an old tea towel that's nice and clean, like a really thin tea towel. So I'm going to open that up, and then I put my presser cloth on top, and then I'm just going to press it gently along here to kind of open these teeth up. So go ahead and do that now to the side of your zip you're going to be starting to work with. So I want to show you another couple of things before we move on. Firstly is my pressed half of my zip, so you can see how it how it compares to the non-pressed half. I did not press this side, and I did press this side. So as you can see, this one is lying almost flat. This one has still got the big ridge of the zip. Now if I was to just close my zip, this pressed one would just spring back up, and it would be as if I hadn't even pressed it. But the pressing really, it's very minor, but it does make quite a difference for being able to stitch close to the zip, particularly if you're not using an invisible zip presser foot. Invisible zip presser foot, I was trying to think of the word. Which brings me to the next thing I want to show you. These are two different presser foots. This is a regular zip presser foot, which goes on your sewing machine, and it's basically got a gap either side of the foot bit here for your zip bit to go underneath, and then it stitches in this little hole. So the idea is that you stitch as close as possible to the teeth to give, well, not as close as possible to the teeth, that you stitch a little bit away from the teeth in order to give that little gap that we talked about before, of the where the fabric does not quite meet the teeth of the zipper, and that stops the fabric getting caught. Because invisible zippers work slightly differently, you want to go as close as you can to the edge, and that's where an invisible zipper comes into play, and this does it automatically. You do not have to manually try and stitch really close to the zipper teeth, which is quite possible, and with pressing open this bit and using this presser foot, you'll be able to get quite close into those teeth there, but probably not quite as close unless you're quite experienced with it as with doing an invisible zipper presser foot. So this one here, when we look at it, if you turn it underneath, you'll see there are two ridges, and that's for depending on which side of the needle you want the zipper teeth or the coils to run. So these coils will run in one of these. It's so hard to show you here. Will run through one of these little kind of grooves. That's where you feed the zipper teeth up through one of those, and then your needle will come down through this gap here and stitch really close to it. So if you do not have one of these and you're planning on doing a lot of dresses or tailored trousers, or even some tailored skirts, I would recommend you get one. If you don't have one, you don't need one. You can just use a regular one as well. So I'm going to show you how to use it with the invisible zipper presser foot. If you don't have one, there are lots of tutorials out there on how to get really close to an invisible zip while using a regular presser foot. Gosh, I've said those words so many times now. There we go. So those are the two different options, and now we are going to start pinning this. So next we want to actually pin our zip on. After all of this talking about it, we've got our top of our zip marked. Now that top of your zip is where the very top edge of the zip is going to go. So I'm not going to zip it back up again because it'll undo the ironing I've just done, but if you see here on this other zip, there is the little stopper at the top of the zip. That is what we want to align at this pin, not this end of the zip, because otherwise there would be a kind of big hole at the end, and we want the gap in our garment to finish right there, so that you don't see a hole into your undergarments while you're wearing it. And what we need to do is align the zip, because the fabric is going to meet as if it's a seam. When the zip is closed, we want to measure it so that the the zipper teeth are placed right on that 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now you can see I've serged this so that the reason I picked this particular method is because I don't want the fabric to fray while I'm trying to manipulate it and show you what I'm doing. But you could serge it, or you can do the bias tape afterwards, but I did not cut any of the fabric off when I serged it. I just serged it to finish it. So this is still the absolute raw edge, and I'm going to measure in 1/2 inch, and that is where I want my zipper teeth to go. Now you could just measure in and place the zip, and if you're really experienced and quite comfortable you could do that, or what I'm going to do to show you is mark it. Now I'm using a blue tailor's chalk because my garment is blue and I don't want to make a big old mess on it, but what I want to do is make several marks 1/2 inch in, and then I'm just going to join them up with a line so that I can see where I'm placing my zipper teeth. And I'm drawing quite a strong line, but it's the same colour as a lot of the fabrics on my dress, so it is just going to brush off really easily. Or you could use, like we've talked about before, some kind of fabric marker that fades or washes out. There we go. Now that gives me a line to start on, and I'm going to place my zipper right side down onto my fabric, and I can check it's right side down by making sure I only see the back of the zip, not the front bit with this with the pull on it. I want to place it face down, and then make sure my zip is not twisted along there, and then I'm going to place the very top of my teeth right on this line that I've marked, and make sure that the top edge of the zip is butted up against that pin. So that's a lot of things I'm trying to align all at the same time while keeping my hands out of the way for the camera. There we go. So what you will notice as I start to pin this around the curve is that the raw edge of the zipper, so that the edge of the zipper here does not match with the raw edge of my garment. Depending on your zip manufacturer, some of them are excuse me, some zips are different widths to others, so it may overlap, it may overhang. It might be wider than 1/2 inch, or it might be less than 1/2 inch. And what I'm doing is I'm going to pin all the way down, following this 1/2 inch line, is all the way to the bottom of the zip. Now I'm only going to be able to stitch to about here with a regular zipper foot. You can often carry on past this bit here, depending on how far away from the edge you are stitching, or from the center you're stitching. But with an invisible zipper foot, I'm not going to be able to go down past this bit here, and that's absolutely fine. I don't want to. I want to finish it just there. So next we're going to go over to our machine, and you can put more pins in if you like, put a couple of extras in to make sure you're really comfortable that it's all secure and it's all sitting at the 1/2 inch line, or you can just put a couple in. I would recommend, if you're not someone who pins or clips a lot, that you at least do a couple around here so that you're going to be starting it exactly where you want. And because this is curved, this wants to uncurve itself the whole time, so, and I don't want it to. I want it to stay curved so that it stays at that 1/2 inch mark. So even though I'm only going to be starting my stitching where this first yellow pin is that I put in to show where the zip starts, I'm going to pin above it and below it to make sure that this zip stays curled exactly where I want it to go. And I'm just getting paranoid now that I've not put in enough pins. There we go. Now I think I've got enough in. Let's go over to the machine and we're going to stitch. So we're at the machine, and I want to show you how I change presser foot. If you're experienced, you'll know how to do this in your sleep. Every machine is different. I've got a You.Make, and this one has a button just behind where when I press it, it just drops the current foot off, and I can take that off, and then I line up my my new my invisible zip one underneath, and I'm going to just lower the presser foot on for it to take hold. And then I now have to deal with the fact that this thread needs to go through the hole there, and it's not through the hole yet. So if I push my needle, let me get back on the right stitch. If I push my needle down through there and I just do one stitch, what happens is underneath it has caught on the bobbin thread, and if I get some tweezers and I just swipe underneath like this, I'll be able to pull it, and it pulls the thread hopefully through the hole. There we go. And then I do not have to poke it through and try and wiggle it around. All you do is just put your needle down, back up again, and then swipe under here with some tweezers, or you could even use a pin. Now that I'm trying to line this up on my machine, I'm wondering why I'm not stitching my zip on my other side of my dress. I really ought to have. It is easier if you stitch your zip on the right hand side as you look down at your back piece, so that you don't have all of your back piece here on this side of the presser foot. It's much easier if it's on that side of the presser foot. And let me just make sure that's focused for you. Is it focused? Yes. So now what I want to do is line up my zipper teeth and my needle so that they're in the right place. And what I want to do is feed my zipper teeth. Now this is hard because it's curved, but feed my zipper teeth into the right hand side hole. So this hole here on the right hand side of the presser foot, not the hole on the left hand side of the presser foot, but the hole on the right hand side, because I want my zipper teeth to go through there and then the needle to come down just on the left hand side of the teeth. I hope I've explained that well. And then I also want to line it up so that my needle is going to go down exactly at the point where my original yellow pin is for where we're going to start. So it's quite a few things I'm going to line up, but once I've done that, all I'm going to do is stitch. So I'm going to put my presser foot down first and just check that it is in fact going through that hole, which it is, and then I can take out the pin that is holding, the pin that's holding it curved, and then I can start stitching slowly. Now there's a lot of pins just around here, and I'm starting it where the teeth is on a curve, so I'm going to just start stitching manually, and then I want to go back a couple of stitches as well to secure it. Whoopsie daisy. In fact, it doesn't matter if you start your stitches above where the pin is, because we're going to join the fabric at where the pin is to seal the seam. Gosh, I don't know that I'm explaining that very well. Hopefully I am. If it's not making sense, please comment so that I can help you or address anything I've not said. This is something that I would just do automatically. I've done it so many times, then trying to think through how to explain it is throwing me for a loop a little bit. So here we go. I'm going to stitch around this curve, and this is so much easier than a normal presser foot, because it is just holding this it's holding this invisible zip open and stitching right next to it. So I don't have to do any of the work that I would normally do. Now, something that I've noticed is it's just got bunched up underneath the presser foot, so I'm just going to lift that up, and I'm just going to place that back down again to keep that nice and flat. Now, if when you put your needle down you're finding it's going too close to the teeth, which is not necessarily the fault of your zipper foot, it might be that the teeth are slightly wider on the zip that you're using, maybe using a different brand zip than the presser foot was designed with, then all you need to do is just use your settings to move your zip slightly, use your setting to move your needle slightly to the left. Just like a millimetre or two would make a difference. to then give the teeth of your zip room to go. Now I'm at the bottom of my zip. The gosh, I wish I knew the name for these bits. I should look this up. The thing that goes up and down on the zip is now in my way, and I'm going to just press my back stitch and go back a couple of stitches and then forward again, and then to get it off I'm going to have to pull it to the side, and most presser foots will have, you know, your lever that takes your foot up and down. If you press your lever directly upwards, it'll lift your presser foot really high. I totally didn't know mine did that for ages, and it's really great because you can get off things without having to pull it through. And I'm gonna clip that. Now when I have a look at the back side of my garment, you'll see that it just looks like regular stitching. When you look at the front side of the garment, you can't see the stitching at all, just there like that. But if I pull the zipper teeth up, you'll see, in fact hopefully that you'll see, I don't know if you can see that, but it is stitched right next to the zipper teeth. And then if I go to the bottom of my zip and pull the whatever it's called up without catching it in it, there we go, it goes all the way to the top and it's like invisible. There we go. So if you go to pull it up and it's not going up, and you've found that you were kind of getting it caught slightly on the coil of the teeth as you were going down, you might need to move your needle over 1 millimeter, I would start with, and try it again. You do it if it's the first time you're doing it. I would recommend you do this with a basting stitch first, which is a long loose stitch. It's still just a straight stitch on your machine, and all you do is you use your setting to lengthen the stitch as long as you can. So my stitch option is usually 2.2 is the length, and I can lengthen it all the way up to a 5. And if I lengthen it up to a 5, what it means is if I pull the bobbin thread, once I've finished my seam, if I pull the bobbin thread, it just pulls straight out and the whole seam just falls apart, and it's as if you'd never stitched it. And it's a great way to try something to check whether or not you've got your settings right for where you're stitching before you then stitch it for real. So baste it first if you haven't done a zip before, and then check it, do the zip up, check that it will do and undo without catching on the fabric, because you want it to look invisible from the outside, which by the time we've stitched the other side on it will do, but you don't want it to actually get caught, be so close that it gets caught. So try it, do your zip up and down, pull your basting stitches out, and then stitch again if it's the first time you're doing an invisible zip. So let's go back, and we're going to now pin the other side and stitch the other side of our zip. So we've got our zip now attached to the back of our garment. What I've done is I've laid the front of the garment face up, and before I do any attaching of the zip to this side, I want to mark where my zip top is going to end. So we are literally doing exactly the same thing that we just did on the other side of the garment. I have got my my ruler, which has vanished. How was it just there? Oh, it's underneath. There we go. And what I have already done is I have marked 1/2 inch in, and I have drawn myself a nice little line along here, so I know where I'm following. Now, before I start pinning and doing exactly the same thing we just did, one of my little tips to make sure that you get your zipper aligned is, and let me just check you can see the whole of the garment here, there we go, is this seam of the front should be exactly the same length as the seam on the back. And just before you go marking it, check that your seams are the same length, that you have not cut one skirt longer than the other or one sleeve longer than the other. Otherwise this is not going to align when you're checking it. And then the other thing is to then go to the hem, assuming they are the same lengths, and line up your raw edges or your serged edges, as the case may be here. And what I am looking to do is to mark where the zip ends, so that I can be checking that the zipper teeth end in the same place, and it all matches up the whole way around, so that you don't end up with your zip looking good, and then you do your zip up and realize that your top is here and your back is there. Sorry, your front is there and your back is there, or your back is there and your front is there. So I'm just going to the end here, and what I'm going to do is just open this up, and I'm going to mark where this ends. And my zip has a very unhelpful little pinking shared edge, which of course stops it fraying, but it means that then I'm never quite sure where I'm marking. So I have lined it up to the tip of the point, so the tip of the points down here should match where that pin is once my other half of my pin has been pinned on here. That's where it should come to, like that. So we are now going to pin and attach our zip, and then we're going to sew it on, and we're doing it in exactly the same way we did before. I'm keep picking up bent pins. I have not pressed open my zipper teeth. I showed you that earlier, and what I should have said is only do that if you're going to use a regular zipper foot. You don't need to do that with an invisible zipper foot. It's just to get close in with the regular zipper. The invisible zip will just deal with that. Now what I want to do is do exactly what we did before. Place the very top of my zipper here, lined up with the with that pin that we put in. And I'm not going to pin this bit here because it will twist my zip around. I'm going to, in fact I've not got it quite on my seam allowance. There we go. Now I've got that lined up with my seam allowance along here, my blue line, and then also with the top of the zip matching where that first pin is that I put in, to match where the zipper notch is. And then I'm going to start pinning around my curve first, and again use as many or as few pins as you want, and then I can come back and pin my zipper kind of seam allowance, whatever that's called, that bit off the edge, last, before I once I've done that first bit. And then I'm just keep the zip flat and put in as many or few pins as you like. Oh, now what I should have said, what it's really helpful to do is do your pins so that most of them run within the seam allowance of the zip, so then before I stitch I can do my zip up and check that it works. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to keep this one up the top as horizontal because that's where I want to check that the teeth match. So I'm going to just put that in exactly on top of that white one, and then I'm keeping my zipper teeth lined up with my 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to pin all the way down inside that zipper tape and the seam allowance so that I can do my zip up and check before I stitch it. And when I get to the bottom, do the points of my zip match up with that pin? Yes, they do. Yay! There we go. So I'm now going to open my garment up as if I was wearing it. Let's imagine I was wearing it, and then I'm going to do it up and check, being very careful to not poke myself or get my zips in the wrong way. Does it all match up? Now my front here is lower down than my back, and that shows me that does not match up. So I have gone wonky somewhere. So what I'm going to do is unpin it, which is a lot easier than unpicking it, and I'm going to move this here up so that it matches, because these two seams should be directly opposite each other on my zip, and they are not, and I'm not quite sure why, because I did check that. So I'm going to just unpin this, and this is one of those kind of things I wish had gone right the first time I'd done this, but equally it's kind of good because I can show you what to do if it doesn't match. So here I'm kind of looking inside and I'm checking where these seams are, and then I'm going to look and see what's happened. I think I haven't followed my seam allowance around very accurately. There we go, that's better. So now I want to check inside. I'm happy with that. Whoops, pulling pins out now. And then I'm going to go and I'm going to stitch that in exactly the same way I did before, but just open up the zip. First, you don't need that done up. In fact, it won't be very easy when it's done up. Practically impossible. So I'm going to stitch using exactly the same method we did before with my invisible zipper foot all the way down there. Here we go, so I've got my zip lined up on my machine, and this time the dress is nice and easy out the other side, which is really nice because we're doing the front versus the back. I should have started with this side to show you, it'd be much easier. And I'm gonna, I've got my my coil of my zipper teeth starting to go into this left hand side of the invisible zip, and my needle is going to come down just to the right of that in the center of the presser foot so that it runs just next to these teeth. I'm going to pull out this pin that's stopping it from going down, make sure that those zipper teeth are up inside my little ridge, and then I'm going to stitch forward a couple and back, and then I want to go slowly around this curve. Now it's a straight ridge inside, so it doesn't like the curve very much, but it does do it. There we go, and that is actually much easier to stitch than it was when I had pressed my zipper teeth open to show you the other zipper type. Really, I ought to have pressed them back or just done the zip up to fix it. Anyway, there we go. So, we're at the bottom, back a couple, forward a couple, done, and I will trim my threads in a little bit, get rid of my pins, and let's see if the magic works. Don't worry about the bits that are undone on either end of the garment. Ta-da! Look at that. So my zip here is almost invisible, and that's why it's called an invisible zip, because to the naked eye, when you are just wearing this garment, you cannot see the zip underneath because it looks just like a regular seam, yet it is a zip. So let's go back and I'm going to show you how to finish either end of the zip, down below and at the top, so that your sleeves and the bottom of your skirt are now done up. So we have our dress here and we have put our zip in. Now what we want to do is finish this underarm seam and finish the bottom underneath the zip seam. So we're going to start with the bottom of the skirt seam, and we are literally just going to stitch straight down here, except there's a couple of things that are going to make it so that we don't end up with a little hole between the bottom of our zip and where our side seam goes. And the first is, when we stitch it, we're going to use a regular zipper foot, not your invisible zip, but a regular zipper foot, so that we can get as close in here as possible. I guess the technical answer is you want to start your stitching right here where the stitching from the zip ends. However, I have found that is almost impossible to get in there, and the better option that I prefer is to I'm going to put my pin in. Here we go. I'm going to put my pin in as close as I can to that bit there, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to start about 1/4 of an inch before my stitching ends for my zip, so there would be an overlap of my stitching, that's from my stitching that runs down of my zip to the stitching that runs down my dress. It's going to be about 1/4 of an inch overlap, and I'm going to use my zip foot to get as close in as possible. So if my stitching for my zip is exactly half an inch in from the edge, my stitching for my side seam is going to start just more than half an inch in, and then once I get past the zip, I'll kind of graduate it out so that it's exactly half an inch out. So I'm going to do that, and the trick is to keep the tail of the zip out of the way so that you don't accidentally end up with it poking through your side seam. And then this is this tunic length one that I decided to do for my daughter, but you would probably have a much longer skirt here to finish. And then before we stitch it, I'm going to flip it over and just check that that pin I put through is right by the right by the stitching for the zip on this side too. I don't want to have put it through and not check in case any of the skirt, for example, got bunched up and it ended up that I'd started pinning there, for example. I want it to be nice and close on both sides. And then at the top of the zip we're going to pin here as well, and again you're going to need to keep the tails of your zip out of the way. I'm going to start at the hem of my sleeve, which I know will be aligned because I checked that when I pinned my zip, and then I'm going to end up stitching. In fact, it might be easier to stitch from this side of the fabric, so that I can start here and go down out towards the sleeves, just in case it has moved, in case the zip has moved and your sleeve hem doesn't align anymore. And I'm going to try and put my pin in right at the top of the zip. Now this is quite tricky on the smaller sizes because the curve is really tight. So if you are doing a child size, or if you've done the practically impossible and decided to attempt this in the doll size, which is technically possible, and we have had one person try it, the dolls in the woven, but it was very tricky. The dolls one I would probably keep in the knit if I was you, like it says in the instructions. Anyway, I've got my pin here as close to that stitching as I can, and as close to that stitching there as I can, exactly the same that I'm going to make it overlap about 1/4 inch so I don't end up with a little hole, and then I'm going to come around the corner. What I was going to say is, if you're struggling to get close in here, what you might need to do is clip in a few times. So I'm going to show you what I mean by that. If you're going to be doing bias tape around this bit here, then that's fine, this will cover this. But what I mean is clip partially into the seam allowance but not all of the way, to help open up, and try not to clip your zip, and definitely don't go into the actual stitching. So I'm clipping about 1/4 inch in there. I don't know if you can see that with all of the serger threads, so that it will help straighten that out. And if you're going to do that, and my pin's just fallen out, I'll be back in a moment. If you're going to do that, it's just for these smaller sizes where this curve is really sharp. On the larger sizes you should find that you're able to get around this curve much easier. So I'm not going all the way in, I'm just going about half of the way into my seam allowance, and I'm just clipping every kind of 1/4 or 1/2 inch just around this really tight part of the curve, because that will help me be able to straighten this out as I sew and get a much cleaner finish on it. Can't pick up my pin. There we go. So I'm going to start stitching at the zip, and I'm going to move out towards the edge. There we go, and I've got my pin in, so I'm going to start there, and I'm going to stitch out for the sleeve, and then the skirt I'll flip my dress over and I will start at the zip and stitch down. So what I've got here is my I'm doing the bottom of my zip down to start with. No particular reason, I've just picked that one. I've got my regular zip foot on, not my invisible foot, and I've got it aligned so that it's ready to stitch down this side. Your regular zipper foot has two sides you can attach to your machine, the left and the right. To do it with the zip on this side and the fabric on this side, I would put the presser foot on so that it was attached on the right hand side of the zip. And I'm gonna come, and there's no way to get your threads kind of out from underneath, so I'm gonna just swipe them to the side to keep them out of the way, and I'm gonna bring my presser foot all the way down to about 1/4 inch before my stitching ends for the zip, and I'm gonna put it down as close as I can without touching the zip. Put my needle in, and then I can take that pin out, and I'm just gonna lift it up and see if I can. It's really hard to see underneath, but what I'm looking for is to check that there's not a bunch of fabric that's kind of got rucked up underneath, and also that I haven't accidentally gone through any of this zipper tape. So I'm just checking it's all clear, and then I'll put my presser foot down, keep my bobbin thread and my two thread tails out of the way, and my zipper tape out of the way as well. And I'm going to just go forward a couple of steps and then back a couple of steps, and then I'm going to stitch down. Now remember, I was slightly outside of my 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm not even an 1/8 of an inch, like I'm really so close to it. So then I'm just going to gradually kind of over about 2 or 3 inches come back in, so I'm bang on 1/2 an inch. And then obviously you're going to have a much longer skirt if you haven't adjusted the length like I did. And there we go, that is, let's get rid of those threads. That is finished. So I don't know if you can see here. Oh, I didn't cut that. I thought I did. There we go. I don't know if you can see this very well on camera, but I've stitched really close to the stitching for my zip, and there's about 1/4 of an inch overlap. If I show you on the other side, it's exactly the same. Really close, and there's 1/4 of an inch overlap. It's probably about not quite an 1/8 of an inch away. And then if I open this up, you will see that this is my zip here. My zip ends there, and then the seam continues, and unless I pull it really hard open, you will never see that while wearing it. If you pull it really hard open, you will see that the seam changes just there, but if it's just, you know, normal wear, you cannot see that at all. So now we're going to do the top half. So my zip is done up. I'm going to undo my zip so that now my zip is undone, and I want my fabric on this side of the machine to make it easier for me, because this kind of feels like a tricky bit. It's really not that difficult, but it kind of psychologically feels like a tricky bit because it involves a zip and a curve, and I just want to have this as easy as possible. And then I'm going to use this thing on my presser foot where I lift it up really high to get over the side. And now I'm going to do exactly the same thing we did before. I'm lining up my presser foot so that it's right next to the top of the zip, and I've put my needle down into the fabric about 1/4 of an inch back from where the zip has started, just as close as I can next to it. Take my pin out, and even though you can't see what I'm doing, I'm kind of looking. You can't see all the way into it. I'm looking. I've got my eyes right down this level here, and I'm looking to see whether there's anything caught under there. There's not. And then before I stitch, the last thing to check is my zipper tape out of the way, because I don't want that poking back through my seam. And no, it wasn't. Oh, I'm glad I checked that. There we go. So now my zipper tape is out of the way, and I can put my presser foot down and I can stitch. So couple forward, couple back, and then we're going to go around this curve. And as you go around the curve, my zipper tape immediately wants to go straight back under there, and if it did that, then I'd have a bit of blue zipper tape poking out under my arm, which would be really annoying. So make sure that is out of the way, all the way to the end, and finished. Now, this is a size 3 to 4, so it's one of the smaller ones with the bit of the curve, and as you can see, this has snipping into this curve has made quite a difference. It's made it look a bit messy with all of my serger threads, but I can clip those up and tidy those up, but it really has helped me open that up. And then if I open up under the arm here, you will see, and it's hard to see because it curves, my zip ends here and then it carries on as a seam, and you can never see the difference. And if I do my zip up, again it's curved, so it's difficult to see, but that finishes and then continues on. So I am really happy with that. So here we are, zip is in one side, there is nothing on the other side yet. This seam here, when you press it, it's difficult to press under the arms, but as much as you can, you want to press that open. And then what we need to do now is pin and stitch our other side seam. So we're going to do it in exactly the same way that we did the knit version, where I'm pinning first this stitch line here and that stitch line there to make sure that they are matching up, because they should match up the under the bust and the back between the top and the skirt. And then I'm going to pin out to the sleeves, and if your sleeve hems, if you've cut them the same length, that should match. And I'm going to do a couple of pins around this corner, because as soon as I start stitching, that will want to move unless you're using a walking foot. And then I would start pinning from the top down, but this is only a tunic, and I've already checked that I know my my hems match, so I can pin at the bottom. But if you had cut them to different lengths, or they had stretched, and if it actually, look, that side stretched, the other side hadn't. So there's a good thing to show you. I'm going to pin from this way down, and then you can see this is about 1/4 of an inch longer than that one, and that's fine. Well, I mean, it's not fine, ideally that wouldn't happen, but it's a good example to show you that then what I can do when I get to the hem here is I can just neatly trim that off. Now that might be that I didn't cut that very accurately, or it could be that it's stretched, but either way, once I've stitched it, I can take my scissors and I can trim them so they are the same length. And then what I would also recommend you do, if you have to do that at all ever, is to take your other side seam, match it up and check that they are the same length. Now there we go, that is exactly the same length. So obviously that bottom bit, either I cut that inaccurately, or it was or it had stretched out. But make sure they're the same length, because if you've trimmed a bit off, let's imagine you trimmed that off and then you're wearing it and you've got one side shorter than the other, that would be really annoying. So do check they're the same length if you ever have to do that. So what I'd like you to do now is stitch down here. If you are going to be serging your garment, because this is woven, if you're just doing the woven version, not the lined version, then what you could do is serge those edges together, or if you serged them separately before we started this section, then you could just press them open. Or if you have not done that and you're doing the unlined version and you want to finish them, then there's the Hong Kong finish, which is detailed in the pattern, which is this exact same bias tape finish, but finishing each individual seam allowance with that bias tape, and then pressing it open. And then if you're going to do it for the zip, you would do the bias tape finish down that side of the seam allowance, and then you do the bias tape finish down that side of the seam allowance, and then you can press them open, and it looks absolutely beautiful. If you have a look in the pattern, that's in the full version of the pattern where the woven one obviously is, and it looks really pretty, especially if you're using a fabric that's opaque, that you can't see through. You could do that in a lighter colour bias tape and make that look really, really, really pretty on the inside. Or maybe I'm just geeky and I like the inside looking really pretty, I don't know, but it's up to you. Because I've serged a lot of this one, what I'm going to do is stitch down and then serge it. So I have stitched down the side seam, and then I have serged down it, or if you have already serged it, you would just press it open. I would now press this towards the back because I've stitched them together. And if you are going to be doing the Hong Kong finish, you do exactly the same thing on the zip side as on the plain side seam, and do the Hong Kong finish on each of the two different seam allowances so that you can press it open. That's it for the woven version. I will see you tomorrow to do the shoulders for the woven version. If you're doing the lined woven version, that's slightly different. So the lined woven version is almost identical to what we've just done. In fact, for your outer fabric, this you would do exactly what we've just done. However, for your lining, you want to do it slightly different. So for your outer fabric, copy exactly what we've just done for the woven version, but you are not going to finish any of these side seams. You could serge them at the very beginning if you wanted, if you've got a particularly frayy type material, but if your material doesn't fray massively, then you would just put in your zip, stitch down the bottom, stitch down the top, and then stitch down this other side for the outer of your fabric. For your lining, for the woven lined version, what you're going to do is you're going to stitch this top bit here, and you're going to stop just before where the zip starts and stitch your bottom bit, and you're going to start just where the zip, just before where the zip finishes. So rather than going 1/4 of an inch past into the zip, I would start at 1/4 of an inch below, so there's going to be kind of 1/2 an inch between what you did on this one and what you're going to do on your lining. So start about 1/4 of an inch before the zip starts, stitch down there, start 1/4 of an inch before where the zip finishes and stitch down there, but leave this section where the zip is completely open. We are going to stitch that by hand when we put the lining into the dress. You can do it by machine, but obviously you'll be able to see it on the outside, so it's going to be up to you. If you're not sure about stitching by hand, what I would recommend you do is just put it in, pin it, and then see how it seams, and then see if you really want to do it by machine or not. It gives a much nicer finish to stitch it by hand, and slip stitching by hand is much easier than it sounds. For the other side of your lining, you're going to do exactly what you just did, stitch down the seam all together, and then press it open and leave it unfinished. So that is the woven lined version. Almost identical to this, you're just doing the outer the same, but your inner you're going to leave the hole where the zip is and not actually put anything in it, because we're going to attach it to either side of the zipper tape when we put the outer and the lining together. And that is it for day 5 of the Portia Party Dress sew along. I will see you tomorrow for the final day, where we are going to finish up the sleeves and the hem and get it all done and dusted. And for the lining, we are going to also attach in the neckline so that it is all attached. So thanks very much. I will see you tomorrow.